right, hello. Just a quick little intro to this video, and we'll get to the main video, the Ultimate Resurrection panel, in just a couple seconds. But there is something I just wanted to say at the outset that I didn't have a chance to say in the show itself. Obviously, the show, we were focusing on celebrating Gary Habermas and his legacy and how he helped me and others to faith, as well as celebrating his new 4-volume Magnum Opus, where he's taking his life research and publishing it into these 4 volumes. However, I did want to say, in terms of the other panelists that I didn't get a chance to mention on the show, I'm eternally grateful to them as well, and very much appreciative of them. Gary Habermas, without him, I would not have come to faith, but others also played a necessary role as well. And a lot of the panelists, so starting with Mike Licona, he was amazing. He's always been amazingly friendly, just like Gary. All of these other scholars were amazingly friendly. Mike, remember him helping me with emails, sometimes dozens of emails back and forth with my questions after I'd had a talk with Gary, and I wanted to follow up with him on things like hallucinations, stuff like that. So Mike Licona was extremely helpful to me coming to faith as well. St. Sean McDowell, he played a pivotal role with his PhD research into the fates of the apostles. And I remember he was so kind. He shared with me for 4 of the apostles that I asked about. He actually sent me parts of his dissertation at the time. This was before he published or anything like that. And that helped bring me to faith and coming up with my argument for the resurrection historically from the appearance to the 12, because that required that at least the majority of the 12 apostles sincerely believed they had a resurrection appearance. And Tony Costa, Ben Shaw, I'll go with him. Ben Shaw, obviously, I've never had any contact with him, but as I said in the show, I always loved hearing stories about him and what he was researching and helping Gary with as his assistant. He was a part of my journey as an unbeliever on that front. And from what I can tell, he seems like a great scholar. I've seen some shows where he's giving his research. So that is definitely a great contribution that I appreciate for Christian apologetics. And finally, Tony Costa. So Tony has if Gary has been the most helpful in helping me come to faith, Tony has been the second most helpful. So in the show, he mentions, he recommended me to Gary Habermas in the first place. And he also baptized me. And he knows my family. I remember him. He stood with me for a long time. But beyond that, he's done even more than that. I mean, he taught me a course on world religions. I'm going to be teaching a show on world religions, and I'll be using a lot of his material from that class because he was such a great teacher. And, week after week, I remember sitting in his office for at least a couple hours every week during that semester when I took his course. And just like Gary, he was so kind and so willing to help answer all my skeptical doubts and questions. So obviously in the show, I'm mostly focused on showing my appreciation and celebrating Gary Habermas and all he's done for me and others and that sort of thing. But by no means, I don't want the other panelists to feel like I don't appreciate them as well. No, I absolutely do. And they, in one way or another, played roles that were necessary for me to come to faith alongside Gary Habermas. So I thank all of the panelists for everything they have done for me and others, and for the Lord in serving Christ as, top-notch scholars and apologists defending the faith. So thank you to all of them. All right, on with the show.
Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And my goodness, today we have probably what I think is going to be the best show I've ever done. The Ultimate Resurrection Panel is what I'm calling it here. It's a show I've been looking forward to doing for years now, literally, celebrating the legacy and research of my friend Gary Habermas, who helped bring me to the faith. As my fans will know, I kind of lost my faith back around 2009, 2010. And for 8 years, I was a skeptic. I was not a Christian. And Gary, as well as the others on the panel, in one way or another, helped bring me to faith. And it was Gary who stuck with me month after month, answering all of my skeptical objections and dealing with my doubts and that sort of thing. And he finally brought me to faith in 2018. And so, yeah, I just want to say my kind of thanks to him and celebrate his research on the resurrection. He's recently published, in fact, today, he's just published his third volume of his four-volume Magnum Opus on the historical evidence for the resurrection. And that's why we're here today with the other panelists and resurrection experts to speak about that and celebrate that. So, first of all, I just want to go to straight over to you, Gary, and say, how are things on your end?
On my end, we are just getting through a huge storm, and I'm concerned about my lake overflowing.
Oh no.
That's a pretty practical question, but this is a great day, Dale. Um, uh, the, the publisher sent me a copy of the book months ago, and I should say right off the bat, Ben Sher was there. Ben is the editor on the third volume because, well, it's a joke between us, a little bit of a joke between Mike and me too. But Ben saw my manuscript that I put together was 500 pages just for volume three, and Ben looked at it and he said, "Doc, these two guys will not call me by my first name, the guys in the middle, but Ben says, Doc, we got a problem here. There's two ways to use a computer, the right way and the way you do it. And he said, you need somebody alongside you and really shape this thing up. Well, Ben had been my research assistant for, well, 13 years before he went on to another ministry. He shaped the whole thing up. And I'll tell you guys right off the bat, this is Ben's count. I would not have had a number in my mind. Ben says that third volume has just short of 8,000 footnotes.
Wow.
So when a particular critic that most of you know went on his program and said, oh, this is where Gary Habermas is going to tell us about his 250 people he interviewed for The Empty Tomb. That's what we're going to find in this third volume. I'm thinking to myself, right, 8,000 footnotes, 250 people. How does that work out? So not a lot of people know what to expect.
Amazing. And just out of curiosity, who was that critic that you had in mind there? So
I probably would rather not use the name on the air.
okay.
But it's and just in case anybody wonders, it's not a well-known scholar. It's a popularist. Let's say that.
Just give us his initials. That's all we need, Gary.
You know who he is, John. You were probably one of his.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. So just before oh, sorry. Go ahead. What was that, Tony?
Gary's got us in suspense now for the rest of the show.
Yeah, maybe he'll reveal it at the end as a bonus. But all right. So,
off the air.
But Ben's amazing, and the stuff that he does. He is the Shaw of Lynchburg.
awesome. So, all right. So just before I bring in our panelists, obviously the plan is to have our panelists kind of give their take as fellow resurrection experts and what they think of Gary's legacy and his research and engage with him. But just before we do that, I just want to ask some introductory questions to you there, Gary. So the first thing is, look, you are world-renowned. You're famous for your research and your minimal facts approach to the resurrection and that sort of thing. You've literally written many, many books, dozens upon dozens of books on this topic. So I'm kind of curious, what was it that made you want to, hunker down and write your magnum opus on it, this kind of finalization of your life's work?
Two questions there. I'll just answer the second one. First question, how did I even get on the resurrection? I was doing an interview. I was doing a podcast today. A host asked me, did I do the resurrection to help people with their doubts? And I just chuckled and I said, no, I'm not that altruistic. I got interested in the resurrection of Gary with his. So that was my history. I knew nothing about the subject when I started. And many, many years later, that was the result. As far as the Magnum Opus, the reason the Magnum Opus was done, and I said this on yesterday's show too, the person who's responsible in a way is sitting right here among you. Now, Ben was my research assistant for 13 years, but it was Mike about, you could probably tell me, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. He had been bothering me is more like it. He had been bugging me saying, you need to write everything down in some books. And I said, Mike, I don't want to spend the last, I think 15 years of my life doing nothing but writing this stuff down. He says, you have to. And that was the end of it. And he would drop it. He would bring it up later. Have you decided to write this stuff out? I'm not planning to do this at all. Third time, you can do this. No. Finally, he said something to me that, in a way, Mike, changed my life. And it was a one-liner. And Mike said this, Doc, I'm not saying you're old or anything, but if you don't settle down and write this thing, everything that's in your head on direction is going to die when you die. And I pretended like that didn't move me. I wished I could say it didn't move me, but it shook me up. And I thought, well, either I have something to share or I don't. I'm not trying to be cocky. I'm not trying to say it's all about me. But if there's things I haven't said yet, seems to me like I have to do it because this is for the kingdom. It's not for me. The kingdom's a lot bigger than me. And if it can be used by people out there, great. Got to admit, Mike, very begrudgingly. Not, oh, I'm the man. I'm going to do this right away. Not like that at all. Very grudgingly. And Ben was my research assistant. And I said, Ben, what do you think? And slowly but surely we kicked it off. But because of that one-liner, do you want it to die with you? Mm-hmm. And Dale, I'll tell you, when I pushed the send button on the fourth volume in December, I rejoiced that a lot of editing would have to be done, but my job was completed in my mind.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, at this point, obviously you have 4 volumes that are coming out. This isn't just a one and done book. This is covering all of your research in 4 different volumes. Just for the audience, do you want to kind of very briefly summarize what each of those volumes are about and what people can expect to find in them?
Volume 1, all 4 books are called On the Resurrection. And then there's one, and the subtitle that differentiates the books. The first book is called Evidence. And again, I've got to thank Mike and both for that. Called me one day, what volume are you going to do first? And because I had all the material there, and we just had to pick. And I won't tell you which one I did. Laugh at me. But I found that I thought you'd go first. And Ben said, no way. It's got to be Evidence first. And I said, no way, Ben. I'd rather prime the pot. First of all, I'd rather get people interested, drop the Evidence book on them. And I didn't know this, but little beknowns to me, Ben called Mike on the phone, and they talked it over, not in my presence, and called me back and said, it's on my side. You got to do Evidence for the first volume. Then I was talking to Mike later. I said, Mike, is that true? He goes, Ben's exactly right, Doc. I don't know how you can do anything else. I don't even see a chance of doing one of the other ones first. And so it's because of Ben and Mike that the first volume is on Evidence. The second volume is called Refutations. And I emphasize they're mostly naturalistic alternatives, but they're not all naturalistic. Because you've got Theodore Keim's 19th century, very influential German view that the tomb was not empty and Jesus was raised as a glorified spirit. He was not raised bodily. And so he's a supernaturalist. So they're not all natural theories, but any contrary theory, the main ones, are in volume 2. With volume 3, people will find this out soon enough. But volume 3, I make a break with the apologetics per se, and I'm basically, and there's more in the world than just apologetics. Volume 3 is on scholarly perspectives, and it's a who's who of people with terminal degrees in relevant fields. And I would define relevant fields as New Testament, theology, apologetics, philosophy, history, archaeology, classics. At people with terminal, not just anybody who sounds off in silly things, but it's a who's who of names across the board. And there are probably more skeptics, atheists, agnostics, Christian writers, let's say Jewish New Testament scholars. There are probably more non-Christians than Christians in the book, because like Tom Wright said years ago about his resurrection of Son of God book, he said, when he talked to ETS, he said, I didn't want to dog any of you evangelicals, but the point of my book was not to tell people about evangelicals. It was to tell people about non-evangelicals and how much agreement there is on these issues. I would say that's the theme of number 3. If you put a bunch of facts out there, and my 12 out there, and then shrink the list from 12 to 6, and that's the minimal facts, people are going to see how much agreement there is. But they're not arguing for the facts. They're just telling you where they are. So it's not really apologetics. It's where an atheist New Testament scholar is on this. It's where a committed evangelical with a degree, a terminal degree in a acceptable area, where they are. It's a who's who on, I don't know, Ben tells me well over 150 questions because he typed it up. He says over 150 questions from Good Friday to the Ascension. Now, there are other issues in there, but it's like, for example, that Jesus called himself deity. But mostly, and there's a whole section on that, but mostly Good Friday to the Ascension. How many questions can we ask, and where are these guys all the way across the board? And I purposely included non-Christians so that people wouldn't think this is a book from one of our evangelical schools and what we all think. 4 is split in 2. It's because Jesus has been raised from the dead. What does the resurrection say about theology? And what does the resurrection say about practice? And Ben, I haven't told you this. I've gotten 2 letters from the editors back in the last week at B&H Academic. One of them, if you guys know Michael McEwen, who was the head academic editor and acquisitions guy, he just got promoted to the top guy at B&H Academic. Just happened 3 days ago. He's now the top guy at B&H. Michael wrote me a note, and our chief editor, Renee, that Ben knows real well. They both wrote me notes not knowing the other person had written to me, and they wrote me a real stunner. Here's what they said. Of your 4 volumes, 3 topics and 2 topics in volume 4, your last half of volume 4 is the most stunning part of the 4 volumes because it relates theology to practice. What does it say to the dying? What does it say to the doubting? What does it say about prayer and worship? What does it say about, and they both said in separate emails, it's easily the best portion of all 4 volumes is part 4, volume 4, 2. And it's not out, by the way, until next summer. They had to put the date back about 6 months, not me, but summer of 26 for volume 4. That's about it, Dale.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that. So yeah, I think the last question I'm going to ask you, just as an intro here. Look, out of everything in your research for the full 4-volume book here, what did you personally find to be the most surprising or the most interesting, just for you as a resurrection scholar?
Boy, that's a one. Most surprising. I mean, as somebody who's lived in this subject, as somebody who I think I've never done anything but this topic, I would think I wouldn't be. That'd be a hard question to answer. But if I could piggyback on that last comment from the head academic editor and the chief text editor, what they say about Volume 4, Part 2. Guys, I'm going to tell you something. This thought I'm going to share with you is only about 3 days old in my mind. I'm thinking I love apologetics from the top of my head to the bottom of my toes. I'm all about it, and there's many people in the world who need it. Ben will tell you with his doubt ministry, there's many people who need to solve their emotions more than to solve their evidences. But I've been thinking the last few days, I'm ready to do some thinking about texts like Hebrews 11:1, 2 Corinthians 5:7 and 8. Where does faith come in? And where does commitment come in? And since it is true, instead of saying over and over again, it's true, it's true, it's true, it's true, where does our commitment to the Lord come in? Where does the place of faith? How strong is faith, bracing what the facts say? That's about 3 days old. And I think that's their comment that was the most moving part of the book. It's shaking me up a little bit. Because now I want to, don't worry, I'm not going into Volume 5 for sure. But I do want to write about things like simple living and use of finances and where the Lord and what's total commitment mean and why was the early church sold out and we don't act like it is. That's probably what shook me up was the 2 editorial comments.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very interesting and fascinating. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Gary. So all right, so at this point, I am going to turn to my panelists, and at this point, I'll start with Mike since he's immediately to my right. So Mike, just before I give it over to you to say your piece on Gary and engage with Gary if you want, just a couple quick questions for you. Number one, what arguments from the first 2 volumes, or if you've read other volumes from all of them, what arguments did you find to be really stood out to you? And what did you find to be the most surprising thing in Gary's books?
Those are good questions, Dale. Now, I've talked with Gary for a long, long time, many years, and we've talked through a lot of his stuff. And so when they asked me to write a blurb for his book, that was easy to do. And I said, there's only one person who knows more about the resurrection of Jesus than Gary, and that's Jesus. I've skimmed through his, but I have not read all of them through. So, but I know Gary well. I know his research and all the stuff that we've discussed over the years. Years, decades. That would be difficult for me to answer. Yeah. So if you will allow me instead, yesterday I put out on my Facebook page and allowed people to be able to. I said, "Hey, I'm going to be on this show tomorrow with Gary and some others, and what questions would you like for me to ask Gary?" And I got a number of them in, and unfortunately, I can't ask them all. So I'm just going to choose 2 of them. Okay. So Jojo Ruba asks, what is the greatest challenge to the claim of Christ's resurrection? And what is our response to it? So let Gary answer that, and then I'll ask the second one. So Gary, what is the greatest challenge to the claim of Christ's resurrection? And what is our response?
This is from the bottom of my heart. I do not think there's a great challenge for the resurrection that puts the fact of the resurrection in any kind of danger. I don't think there's an objection that, wow, if I'm in a debate I'm doing a podcast, I don't want to be asked this question. I'm not aware of anyone like that. But I'll tell you the most common one. I'll shift it just a little bit. I think our scholars have moved from maybe this happened, maybe that happened. In the last couple years, two of the greatest skeptics, each of whom held a single naturalistic theory, they passed away. And that's Gary Ludemann, the German New Testament scholar from the Jesus Seminar, and he held hallucination. And the other one, we may not think of him as the world's greatest scholar, but John Shelby Spong actually taught a course years ago on the resurrection at Harvard Divinity School, which I don't know what it proves, but he held this what Paul Meyer at Western Mission called the theory he called Peter's happy hunch. And it's a theory that Paul had this sense of something and spread it to everybody else by talking about it. But my point is they both died. And now almost none of the well-known scholars will take a naturalistic theory and will stand on it and say, here I stand. If I'm right, you're wrong. And if I'm right, Christianity's not true. I think there's a widespread fear that if they did that, they would be blown away. I actually had a guy tell me that in a debate one time. He said, I will not pick a naturalistic theory. And he was an atheist. And I said, why not? He said, because pick one, you'll put me in a corner and I will not be comfortable. And I said, time out. You're a naturalist. I'm a theist. I'll tell you what I think happened. The God of the universe raised his son from the dead. Your turn. You're a naturalist. What do you think happened? And he was starting to get angry at me. And he goes, great. So you want me to throw something out there? Okay, fine. The disciple stole the body. And I'm thinking to myself, yes, what a great thing. And I think it's a big trend today. Naturalistic theories, one of them, they're not around, but I think this is the biggest objection. This is not a supernatural world. Those things don't happen. That's not the world we live in. I haven't seen a resurrection. You haven't seen a resurrection. You can say whatever you want, but I don't see any reason to believe in something like that. And a lot of you know, I won't explain this one, but that's why I started studying near-death experiences years ago. And I would argue like this. If there's an afterlife, and I think NDEs are virtually irrefutable, if there's an afterlife, then you ought not turn down a study of the greatest afterlife story in human history. If there's an afterlife, tell me why this story of the afterlife is wrong. So I think it's this is not a supernatural world objection rather than a natural objection. And that, by the way, is why I have an appendix of book 2 against naturalism.
Cool. All right. Here's the second question. There's so many good ones too. I'll ask more, but here's this Mike Burnett. I think you know Mike. If you could only preserve one sentence from all your research, church 500 years from now, what would it be?
Do you mean something in apologetics or do you mean something in application?
Well, just from all, like anything that's in your ministry, your 4 volumes that's dealing with the resurrection, could be practical ministry, could be, minimal facts, whatever.
All right, I'll give you a sentence.
In one sentence, what would be one sentence that if the church only got one sentence from all your research that would be remembered 500 years from now, what would it be?
Tell you what, I'll give you a sentence for each one on theory, one on practice. In theory, I would summarize a minimal facts argument. Mike, you talk about presenting the gospel on a postage stamp or talking to somebody, a taxi driver in 5 minutes. I would say for the theory one, if you can take the facts which are held by virtually every reputable scholar in a closely aligned field with a terminal degree, I would say that there's enough evidence to show assuredly that the resurrection of Jesus occurred. That'd be my sentence based on now, and it's not because they agree with it. They agree with it. That's just an explanation. It's not because they agree with it. They agree with it. That's where the evidence is. Okay. My practical sentence, the one I would save. You folks know that Mike was at the funeral, but my wife of my 4 children died in 1995. Mike across the state, literally across the state of Virginia, to be at the funeral. And the one thing I would say for practical is this. Because Jesus has been raised from the dead, believers who follow the teachings of Jesus Christ can rest assured that we have eternal life, kingdom with God and our loved ones and friends forever.
Wow.
That's pretty cool. I know that when my mom died and in 2013 and when my dad died a year later, I took great comfort at both times, to know because of the resurrection that they weren't, I mean, their physical body was dead, but they were more alive than ever. That they were alive at that very moment and in indescribable joy, and that I will see them both in the relatively recent future. That brought extreme comfort to me. So yeah, I appreciate that. Our dog died a few years ago, and it was heartbreaking to our family. And what was so heartbreaking to me, I mean, my wife will tell you, Debbie will tell you that I cried more when my dog died than when both my parents died combined. And it's not because I love my dog more than my parents. It's because I have the assurance I'm going to see my parents again. I don't have that same assurance with my dog. I mean, I'd like to think that I'm going to see my dog again, but I don't have that assurance. And it's like, wow, the sting of death really is taken away for those who are in Christ. And wow, just to be able to rejoice that I'll see my parents again. So yeah, that's really good stuff, Doc.
Awesome. Well said. Awesome. So, yeah, just before I go to Ben, Mike, I'm just kind of curious. You are a resurrection scholar yourself. Where would you rate Gary's 4-volume books in terms of the resurrection scholarly literature? Is it, yeah, like what's your take on its place there? Is it groundbreaking or?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is his life's work. And I'm really glad he did it because I'd hate for it, all this he's done and accumulated in his head. I'd hate for that to die with him. So, I mean, it's the finest thing ever written on the resurrection. I mean, there's more stuff in there than anywhere else. It's encyclopedic. So, I mean, it's really important. And anybody who wants to become a resurrection expert or to be able to have a lot of questions answered and to get deep into it, they will have to have these volumes. I mean, it will be a must that you have to have in your library because there's so much in it.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. So, all right. So I'm going to turn to our next panelist in order, Ben. And Ben, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you until now, but I feel like I know you because I heard so much about you while you were assisting Gary Habermas during my unbelieving phase there. But yeah, Ben, before I turn it over to you to give your kind of 10 minutes to say what you want to say about Gary, just want to ask you the same questions. I'm kind of curious for you, what do you think were the arguments or evidences that really stood out from Gary's books, and what surprised you the most?
Oh, those are good questions. The argument that stands out the most is cumulative force. I mean that metaphorically, but also physically. When you drop those books down, there's a force to them. And then you find out there's a second book with it, and then a third, a fourth. I used to carry them around to show people the thickness. I'm just getting too tired carrying them. They're so big, and I get fatigued. That's why I try to work out just to carry the books. Um, but yeah, definitely the cumulative effect of the number of facts, but also the number of supporting lines of critical historical data that support each of the facts. But what's nice is at the end of volume 1, for example, there's a nice outline of the historical evidence, so you can get a quick snapshot. But then volume 2 comes in, and it's right back to work, looking to see how those minimal facts apply to these alternative theories and how they all fall short. So it's really good. But also, the section in the very beginning of volume 2 has some chapters where Habermas looks at some 18th, 19th century scholars, particular scholars at that time, and present a alternative view to Jesus's death and resurrection. And then he'd contrast that with another group of liberal scholars who put together alternative theories against resurrection and just attack one another for their alternative theories, showing historical weaknesses of both or how they fail to account for all of the relevant data. I thought that was a really great chapter, a good one too, just the history of alternative theories. So just seeing that, and it also for me personally, it's kind of comforting to see that there's nothing new under the sun. A lot of the things you hear today, so we can look back to those things. So pretty interesting there. And one of the things that I guess surprised me, now there's a few things. One of them is funny because the fact that Habermas types with 2 fingers, and you're wondering how can a guy who types with 2 fingers do 4,000 pages? That in and of itself is something of a miracle within our lifetimes too, not just over the course of 50 years, but we were able to do it pretty quickly. That's one of the elements, and just seeing the thought that goes on behind each volume and how Doc thinks and how he assesses the arguments, puts them forward, and is able to go down a rabbit trail and come back up 40 minutes later to that point of the rabbit trail and connect it all back. So those are some of the elements there that I found interesting, maybe or surprising. Maybe that's a little bit more behind the scenes kind of thing, but interesting less for me. And then some of the questions, I think I got just 2 questions. They're somewhat related. One is, well, I'll do this one first. What do you think, Doc, is the role? Let me preface it with the first question Licona asked. What are some of the biggest challenges to the resurrection? And my thought didn't actually go to alternative theories. It went to unbelievers as being perhaps one of the biggest challenges. So how do we equip believers? So the question from that would be, what role does apologetics have or apologists have in the local church? How can they get more involved? That's one of the things we are really trying to help encourage, but I was just curious of your thoughts on the role of that, apologists or apologetics in the local church.
Well, Ben, you asked that question, and people who don't know what you're doing right now, we can't read the name on your shirt, but it's good advertising for Core Apologetics. Ben and a fellow PhD, Ron Davis. Ron has been doing it for, 10 or 15 years, but he left the pastorate as executive pastor position to work with doubters. And he's had thousands of discussions with doubters, and he ended up doing his PhD dissertation on what the research says on doubt. Ben and Ron became very good friends, and Core Apologetics is a ministry that deals with 2 subjects, as I understand it. First of all, having the resurrection and other things in hand, what do we say to doubt? And secondly, what do we say about discipleship, which is into what I said a few minutes ago when the 2 chief editors at B&H said to me the last part of the letter was the most moving because it starts to go off of that area. And here's these 2 guys who've been doing that full time. And for example, one of Ron Davis' finds, and it's been other places too, About 70% of all doubt is emotional in nature. It's emotional. It's not give me 50 evidences. Oh, thanks for the 50. Do you have 5 more? Oh, thanks for 5. Do you have another 3 or 4? No, because oftentimes those people are not 1 inch closer than when they asked the first question. So these guys are trying to wade in and believers, and they do a fair amount with unbelievers who want to know why should they be secure in their faith and how can they handle their emotions, number one. And number two, how on to follow Christ. Um, Ben, when you finish volumes like this, and it took 13 years, and of course there were decades in my life of research and many, many books before that. I've never asked myself, but there is a time when you say, what needs next? Where do we go from here? It's not a 5th volume on the resurrection. It's something about waking up the church.
Yeah.
And I think you, Ron, are doing. I've done a piecemeal when people write me questions and say, how do you answer this objection? And almost always I say, I'll answer your question, but I don't think that's what you want. I think you want to ask me, what about your emotions? And you guys are doing that full time. I think that's where we got to go. I think we've got to go from it's true and it's not being disproven anywhere. So what are y'all going to do about it? And if I just pick one question, Ben, I would ask from that. It'd be this. I'm prejudiced that this would be my question, but I would say, if you're interested in the kingdom and you're interested in people taking further steps, what are you doing with your finances? Because I think in North America, we have 2 Canadians here. I think in North America, finances run our lives. We're into what we have and what we want and I'm wondering who else could use some of that, and how radical should I be into giving? And how radical should I be into helping people get through their doubts? And do I just give them an answer and go? Or do I deal with them? So I'm now, you can tell what's going on already in just a few comments. I'm wondering, where do I go from here? And is there more to do? Maybe my next PhD course, when they ask me for a topic, which they've been doing, and I mean, I have to do what's required, but about seminar topics, I'm thinking about being sold out. What does it mean? Why aren't we doing it? Why are we not much like the church? If it's true, and we know that more than ever before, why are we cutting our lawn instead of going to the rescue mission downtown?
Yeah, that's if you remember, and for those of you who don't know, part of my story is I came to Liberty and I didn't know like Paul wrote half the New Testament. I came to Liberty kind of like how Doc started, not because I was trying to help others with their doubts, came because they had a hockey team. And I got introduced to Dr. Habermas as the hockey coach. So I come to find out this hockey also writes resurrection books. And so that's how we end up getting connected. And I asked him some questions, and just like he said, in some emails, I just had factual doubts though, because I was wrestling with these discipleship issues as I came to Liberty and starting to learn more. And so that has actually helped change a lot of even my perspective on those things you're discussing there, because from reading N.T. Wright in our discussions, N.T. Wright words it's so great. And at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, in verse 58, Paul says, okay, so it's all kick your feet up, wait for Jesus to return. He's going to set the world straight. But that's not what Paul says. He says, be steadfast in your good works, for they're not in vain. And so that has been motivating and encouraging and convicting for me as I've studied the resurrection, to ask myself, okay, be steadfast in the good works. So what good works am I doing right now that I can be steadfast in? Am I doing them? So it's been a good challenging point, and it should be. So it helps the head, the heart, and the hands all come together, especially when it's oriented around that which is of first importance. Second question, be a little more, I assume briefer, but what is something encouraging moving forward that you're thinking about regarding resurrection research? Something that's you're feeling optimistic about or excited about?
I am most optimistic about where we are in the field. And I was reading a book the other day, a very moving book. I'll hold it up here if anybody hasn't seen it. This is a theology professor from Seton Hall University. He's Roman Catholic. You wouldn't know that if you read it. He talks like an evangelical, but he was Jewish.
Over? They couldn't see it in the camera.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jesus' resurrection. A Jewish convert examines the evidence. The author's name is Jeffrey Morrow, Morrow. Jesus' resurrection. A Jewish convert examines the evidence. And he says some stunning things in there, as coming to this a lot later than I did, and that was for me. I wanted somebody to say, what you are now. Same question is asked. He thinks it's too young to say we're post-resurrection, but he thinks the resurrection research has been done. It's established. Nobody's picking the major theories anymore. He's got research on New Testament. That's his area, New Testament and theology. And he's saying people like Bauckham and Hurtado and Tom Wright and others, they've won the day. Reliability of the New Testament is coming in like never before. And we should march out with that basis and proclaim the gospel rather than going back and rebuilding the basis for reliability, inspiration, and everything else. Let's say the resurrection happened. Let's say the critics have abandoned their goofy stuff, and let's march forward as a kingdom. It's a very moving thesis. And I'll tell you what, this guy's got bib in the back, French, German, English. That's probably close to half the book. So it's moving.
Awesome. All right. So yeah, thank you so much for that, Ben and Gary. So I want to turn on to our next panelist, Dr. Tony Costa. And yeah, Tony, just before you go into your 10 minutes engaging and saying what you want to say about Gary, I'm just curious, two questions. What evidence or arguments from the volumes that you read did you find to be the most significant? And what did you find to be the most surprising in the books?
Yeah, well, the thing I found the most significant about Dr. Habermas's work is, first of all, just the way that he is relatable. He's very academic, but he's not over your head. He's very academic, but he speaks in such a way that you can relate to him. I mean, I used to think way back in 1990, there was a debate at the University of Toronto between Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Henry Morgentaler, the famous abortion doctor. And I thought I thought that he was the only resurrection until I met Dr. Gary Habermas. And so what I find about Dr. Habermas's work is, and I like what Dr. Licona said, that it's important that he gets all of that down on paper, because this is going to be his legacy. I think one of his greatest legacies to the academic world is this volume work that he's working on. But what I just found about his work is that he doesn't hold much, presents alternate theories. I was very struck by. I really enjoyed his challenge of alternate Christologies, alternate Christianities. You'll hear a lot of folks say that Christianity was not monolithic. There was a lot of Christianities, the Gnostics, the Ebionites, and all these other groups. I just really enjoy how he challenges that, and he brings us back to this understanding that a lot of scholars make propositions, like Elaine Pagels, for example, or the novels. She presumes, I mean, a lot of her argumentation, I find personally, and Dr. Habermas has mentioned this, is that she presumes a lot of what she says without giving any evidence for it, concrete evidence. Perhaps in the Gospels, we have that. What I enjoy about this book is that it is readable, it's relatable, it is academic, but at the same time, it's something that a back or a master's graduate student is able to digest. And I just find that that is his primary strength. I was also, and this is not related to Dr. Habermas's book, but I was very struck by the fact that he spent time with the famous atheist Dr. Anthony Flew and engaged him on the resurrection and the reliability of the resurrection of Christ. And that to me speaks volumes that Dr. Habermas is not just someone who just was in an ivory tower writing on resurrection studies, but that he actually spent time with Anthony Flew and shared the gospel. It was I guess an evangelistic outreach as well. So I just find Dr. Habermas, his work to be very winsome. It's approachable. And I would say those are the main features that really strike me. But I really liked his engagement with the whole argument about the alternate Christologies. And when I did my doctoral thesis, I worked on worship and the risen Jesus and the Pauline letters. And so a lot of my work engaged with Bauckham and Hurtado and some of these scholars who argue for an early high Christology. And I even got the opportunity to meet Dr. Hurtado actually at one of the SBL meetings before he passed on. A great man. And so I really, really, I really relish Dr. Habermas's Opus Magnum. And the words of the preacher or Kohelet in Ecclesiastes 12, the writing of books, there is no end. And that's so true. But I think that Dr. Licona's advice that Dr. Habermas write this down, put it down on paper, posterity's sake, I think that's going to be a tremendous blessing to the church and to the academy as well.
Awesome. So yeah, at this point, you can take up to 10 minutes or less, whatever you want to do to, say what you want to say about Gary or engage in questions, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask. Dr. Habermas, a lot of my followers and students usually ask, what are the best books to read on just a beginners on apologetics on the resurrection? What would be your recommendation for these who are zealous to defend the Christian faith, but they really want to start learning about the resurrection? What would be the best beginner's book in your opinion?
At the undergraduate level, Tony? Yes, I wouldn't send them to Wright or Mike Licona or any of those 4 volumes. But I'll tell you what, I'll just go back to some of the ones I was teed on. Back when someone told me the argument, I thought the argument sounded good, but I have no clue if the resurrection happened. An old time book, first of all. James Orr's book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a brilliant book and a brilliant treatment of naturalistic theories from 1908, as I recall.
Wow.
And he's got 2 long chapters on maybe the most virulent comebacks from skeptics, one on hallucinations, in which he also handles objective vision, the Theodor Keim theory, but visionary views, especially hallucination, and one that is the Greco-Roman legend thesis that Christianity stole the teaching of resurrection from Greco-Roman sources. Now remember, this is 08. That's the heyday of Religionsgeschichte. It's the heyday of the German history religions movement. And Fleer and so many others, they're doing this thesis, and he's writing while it's alive, while it's dominating. I would say James Moore's Resurrection of Jesus. And if you want to move a lot closer to the present, there are other books that have maybe better reputation. Um, I some of the books and put them down, but some of the better known ones, the better known ones on the resurrection are not all that insightful, and I wouldn't recommend them today. But if I were to starter book, I would say Bill Craig's book, The Sun Rises. I would say the McDowell's book. Sean's father, Josh, wrote one on the resurrection factor. Then later, Sean, I believe you came in and co-author now of that book, right? Sean and Josh's book on the resurrection is, you know, it's always in danger when you start naming people and folks are sitting here.
Yeah,
But
he left out the one that Gary and I co-authored.
Exactly.
well, but yeah, and I've got it right here, The Case for the Resurrection. But Mike, I don't know. I started that book with the chapter called History 101. I don't know if I'd call it an introductory book on the resurrection. Maybe it is. Maybe it's an intermediate book on the resurrection. But I think people can get through it. How can people be blessed jumping in, doing a BA or an MA? I think they could handle that.
I can tell you they can handle The Case for the Resurrection because that's what I read undergrad and learned the hockey coach. And so that was the first book I ever read on the resurrection.
With the chapter History 101.
That's what I needed too.
And Ben ended up doing his dissertation on philosophy of history. So, okay. All right. I'll put those three there. And then you can graduate to reading Mike's book on the resurrection and Tom Wright's book on the resurrection came out pretty closely in time, and they're about the same amount of pages. I'll always remember Mike said when he went to ETS for the first time, InterVarsity was hawking Mike's book on the resurrection of Jesus, historiographic approach, and the guy from IVP was holding the two books up against each other and said, "Look at this. Mike's book is longer than Tom's book." And I guess that's the standard for which book is the best there. But both those books excellent. But I think you should read the other ones and get your feet under you. And if you want to put Mike's and my book in there, at that level, I'd be pleased to hear that. And then people go on. You can graduate. I guess you can move up.
Right. Yeah, I can just add as well, follow up with that. Notice you've also done some work on the Shroud of Turin. So can you maybe say something, Dr. Habermas, about the relationship of your resurrection studies with that of the Shroud of Turin? Because as you know, there's a lot of seems more interest now more than ever, and many are moving towards the authenticity of the Shroud, that it's authentically that of Jesus of Nazareth. So can you maybe, for those who are studying resurrection and then looking at the Shroud, would you say that the Shroud is a mark, a divine mark of the reality of Jesus Christ, his death and the resurrection?
Well, I get asked on talk shows what I think about the Shroud. And I'll make a joke, but then I get in trouble for making this joke later because the group of people known, the Shroud enthusiasts in this country and around the world, they call themselves the Shroud crowd. And they get upset when I say this. So the talk show host will say, "How positive are you on the Shroud?" And I'll say, "It depends on what side of the bed I got up in the morning or if the sun is shining." Now, Mike and Bill, I haven't slept in a bed for 10 years, so that's a horrible illustration. I sleep in a chair. So whatever side of the chair I got up on, I don't think I would take a strong stand and say the Shroud has to be. It's an authentic archaeological artifact, man who was crucified. But I would say that the Shroud, there's probably in my mind, if you want me to put a percentage on this, I'd say an 80% chance. And on good days, I think people, science get in there and go after the shroud like I can't go after the resurrection. And the critical group hasn't done anything against it. And just recently, I've noticed the last few weeks that 2 or 3 of the top New Testament scholars have endorsed the shroud.
Mhm.
The latest, just recently, Ben Witherington just wrote, he's done it before, but Ben just wrote on it and said um, he endorses the shroud. He also, as you know, co-authored a book with the Jewish scholar on James's ossuary. But Ben, I think more people holding it a little bit arm's length because it seems like what a colleague of mine at Liberty here calls dirty thumbnail apologetics. It's like you sort of get in, but you're not really doing the heavy stuff. But as they see that the theories knocked down one by one, and they're not, and this theory is from a lot of university physicists that the image on the shroud is from a man who was crucified, and there's radiation coming out from the dead body is by far the most theory. So I hold it there as an evidence, but I didn't say. If you look in the index, the shroud is mentioned a lot, but not because I treat it.
Right.
Then when I'm doing refutations or evidences, I'll say, and if the shroud is authentic, you ought to bring it in here. And that's all I say. I got 2 books on it, and there's evidence there, and more stuff's coming out. I'm happy about. I wonder what happens if the Lord is. I mean, what if the Lord allowed that for this day and age? I don't know, but it's a lot of people. Well, I'll tell you guys a real brief story. I've got a book up there. Some people call it the best book on the shroud. It's by a leading shroud researcher. It's an encyclopedia of the shroud. Well, I'll tell you the story. He's a lawyer, and every day he would walk across the street into a coffee shop, get a cup of coffee, sit down, grab a newspaper, see what's in the news, put the newspaper, go back to his office, and do his late afternoon work. He walked across the street one day, and he was walking past the newspaper section for something to read while he's having a cup of coffee, and he sees this book called Verdict on the Shroud by Ken Stevenson and Gary Habermas. Ken was this scientist. Ken was the spokesperson and editor for the group that investigated the shroud in 1978, the Stirrup Group. And he picked the book up and he said, I saw the face on the book, the shroud, and he said, I just started letting it go. My language was not very clean. And he said, that blankety blank, 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 blank book. And he threw the book down on the shelf and went back and got his coffee. As he was coming back by the book deal, he picked the book up again and he goes, why not? And he went over, sat down at the table and started reading the book. A little bit later, I met him. He wrote to me and he said, I want you to know something. I picked up that book for several days in a row and I read your shroud article. And I want you to know I'm a born-again Christian because of your book. And he said, I couldn't refute it. Now, he was the best man at the wedding of the #1 shroud scholar in the world. He sent me the book when the book came out. He's done 2 of them. And he wrote to me in the front. He said, I'm sending you this because if you hadn't written your book, I wouldn't be here talking about it. I wouldn't be part of the body of Christ. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying we never know how something might come.
Mm-hmm.
And it might come from hard historical evidence. There was a famous philosopher years ago, Bill Alston at Syracuse, who to Christ at a cathedral in England because as he looked up to the sky and saw the cathedral pointing up, he was overcome with the glory of God and became a believer because of the majesty of Christian theology. And for the rest of his career, he devoted his life to Christ. World famous philosopher. We never know how people come. So
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you, guys. So, yeah, last but not least, he's been waiting patiently. We have Sean McDowell. So, Sean, yeah, just before you go into your 10 minutes with whatever you want to say or ask Gary, just a couple quick questions for you. What did you find to be the most standout arguments or evidences in Gary's books? And what did you find to be the most surprising?
Yeah, two things stood out to me, Gary. I feel like I've been waiting for decades for the 21 arguments for the empty tomb. Telling us that they're coming. You've hinted that there's about 2 dozen, and I've always been wondering, well, what are they? When is he finally going to give them to us? And they're in this book, and I just love. I haven't seen it anywhere else. I appreciate that. Rate them from stronger to weaker, and you start with what I think is the best. Like you've said, the same thing about the women witnesses. So to me, that's worth the price of the whole book, which is not cheap for the record, but it's worth it. Uh, Second, I loved the section on the medical evidence for the death of Jesus. I was not aware that there were so many medical studies that were done. You know, the famous one is the 1986 on the physical death of Christ in JAMA. And I was aware of a handful of others, but I should have checked how many pages that you go on and on comparing and contrasting and assessing. And that really brings me to what's most surprising about this is how much new information there is in this. Now, the structure, the basis of it is what you would expect with a book from Gary Habermas. You haven't shifted in that. But I'm reading this going, I haven't heard this quote. I haven't heard this argument. So I'm actually, if you had to do your best to assess, and I know this is hard, when I helped my dad update evidence that demands verdict, I counted the number of chapters that were new. I looked at their length, and I looked at the chapters that we just did and tried to assess how much we changed. And my best was like 75% new material. I think that's a fair estimate. What would you say, at least in, let's just say the first 2 volumes, how much of that, if you had to guess, is new material?
Now, Sean, I missed a couple words that probably changed your question. Did you say you think that your book with your dad was 75% new material? Are you saying that about what?
Evidence that there's a verdict, I think, is 75%. The 2017 update is 75% new from the 1999 version.
I can almost reach across my desk and pull the shelf right there in front of me. Yeah, you know something? I was doing my PhD when that book came out.
Wow.
Not the new one, but the first one.
It was 72, I think.
I was doing my doctorate in 75.
Right.
So that was why I was in the car. I was popping in tapes into my tape machine on the way to Michigan State, listening to your dad lecture.
Amazing.
And with that famous back of the book of him lecturing what school he was at. Yeah, and you know what? I would agree with the volume 1 and volume 2 that your dad did, because at that time there were some basics on reliability and some stuff on the resurrection. But apologetics in those days, it was not developed like it is today.
That's right.
Just in the group that's here, apologists, if you're going to do a PhD related field, you have to invent a new area to work in. Want to go back and say 41 arguments for the Gospel of John's reliability. Now, Craig Blomberg has done that in a huge book, and he calls it the fourth quest for the historical Jesus. That's new. You guys broke some new ice with that. Your dad, before you got involved, and then he was quoting all these people. So we realized at that time, he didn't say it per se, but we were realizing that a lot of scholars who we don't really think of as dyed-in-the-wool Christians are admitting this and that and this and that. So a lot of those quotes and bib in there, I think, are good. I don't know if I should ask Ben or Mike that question. I don't know if I have a thought for how much of what I wrote is. Okay, here's one. You're 21 arguments for the empty tomb. And they're all way constructed minimal factually by using arguments that critics allow, not by saying the tomb is empty because John 20 says so, period. I think maybe, I think one of the things is that the 6 minimal facts upon which I base a minimal case for the resurrection, I was surprised when I counted how many evidences there are for each of those facts, arrived at the way critics do, and not so, I go from big to small sometimes, but I don't mention the ones that are too small to even be mentioned. And those 6 facts had an average of 15 evidences per fact done critically. So when you talk about the empty tomb and you say 20, well, the empty tomb, it has a lot of data in its favor, but the other, it's not one of the minimal facts on my list. So on the other 6, average 15. They're behind the 20. And I was surprised when I added this up and found that many. There were so many. And I think what that means is when somebody comes up with naturalistic theory, they don't know how many things you might unleash at them, because there's a lot of stuff. I don't mean just from my books. There's a lot of stuff in the research out there. They might get hit with a comeback that they haven't heard before. More comeback than there are critical things. So that would be one of them. You mentioned the empty tomb. I mean, they're all like that, though, with 15 to 20 evidences per. I don't know. Volume 1 has an appendix on evidential near-death experiences. I just did my 3rd one, 2 of them for Blackwell and 1 for Discovery Institute, the ID people. They just did a book on mind dualism. I've got 3 now, and I'm going to tell you, this isn't the time to, but if you haven't seen the latest stuff on NDEs, when I wrote my first essay for Blackwell in 2015, I mentioned 300 evidential cases. When I sent the one in a few weeks ago for my 3rd essay, I listed 500, up from 300 to 500 evidential cases. And over 4 dozen of them are cases where there's no known heart or brain function. And yet they produced evidential cases that they were somewhere else. So that's why I start now with an afterlife. And I go, most facetiously, hey, have you ever heard about the resurrection? I move from afterlife to the resurrection. I also use afterlife as a refutation of naturalism, because Bertrand Russell says to be a theist, you have to have God and an afterlife. And I go, well, I'll let JP and Bill Craig and others do existence of God. I'll try to contribute some afterlife stuff here. And you put the 2 together, and naturalism's wrong. So I think that's something else. That's an excellent volume 2.
That's great. That's really helpful. I've got a couple comments and a couple questions for you. Number 1, you mentioned the book Resurrection Fact. The first time I talked with you that I can remember on the phone, I was helping my dad update that.
Yep.
Was stuck on Apollonius of Tyana and claims about him that, Jesus was copied after him as a miracle worker. And I remember my dad goes, why don't you just call Gary? And I remember thinking, why would Gary talk to me? I'm just like I'm a high school teacher at this time. He goes, well, just try. I reached out, and you not only talked, you probably for an hour answered my questions, and you listened and you asked how you could help. And that was like my first impression. I was like, wow, this guy's not only a brilliant scholar, but just takes time for people. And I get busy sometimes, and I know I don't always do this, but that's in the back of my mind a lot. I'm like, take time with people. This is what matters. You shaped me there, Gary. And the other thing is, I think, Tony, you mentioned this, your interaction with Flu, I think, was transformative. I remember thinking, wow, here's a first-rate, brilliant scholar. And he's just talking about befriending people. And you never tried to own Flu. I think you could have. He was obviously brilliant. He was getting a little older, didn't know resurrection as well as he knew other stuff. And you were kind and you were gracious with him. And I just thought, that's the kind of apologist I want to be. Now, I have 2 questions for you. Interestingly enough, I was at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, Monday night doing a Veritas forum, and I believe that they told me that's where one of your dialogues with Flu was a number of years ago.
Yep.
The book came out of that. Is that right?
Yep. All 3 of them have been published. Yep.
All 3 have been published. And I was dialoguing with an atheist, and he made this argument. I'm just going to tell response, and I'm curious if you agree with me. If you don't, correct the record. He started off in our opening remarks and he said, you can't argue from the resurrection to God and then turn around and argue from God to resurrection. Circular. And I simply said, well, if you don't start with the assumption that miracles can't happen, and we have an understanding of miracle as, say, a divine action that can't be explained naturally, it points towards divine action, then it seems to me if we qualify as a miracle, that could point towards God. On the other hand, we could arguably establish the existence of God through cosmology or through consciousness or fine tuning. That seems to point towards miracles being probable. I don't think it's circular. Do you agree with that? Would you add or take anything away from that response that I gave to him?
The first half of book 4. People may just. I'll be surprised if anybody says they notice this, but since I've been saying it out loud, more people will be saying it. I do not call the resurrection a miracle until volume 4, because miracle is a very hard philosophical case to make. Now, I define miracle in book 1, but I don't say what I think the resurrection is until volume 4. And in volume 4, I start with a discussion of a theistic universe. What does it take to have a theistic universe? Why naturalism fails? Then I go to the claims of Christ, and I'll use the old argument that's everywhere in resurrection books. If God raised Jesus from the dead, what he says about himself must be true, because God would not raise a heretic from the dead. It's an old theory that sounds like a Sunday school argument, but try to refute it. If there's a God in the universe, and if Jesus made those claims, and if God raises him, is the problem with God unless Jesus is who he said he was? And I think the clearest textual evidence for Jesus' self-claims is before the Jewish leaders in Mark 14, 61 to 64. And by the way, a number of the top New Testament guys, Craig Evans, Wright, Mike, some of the top people are going to that passage now. Is Darrell Bach's book on blasphemy and exaltation in ancient Judaism, where he told me he was at a sabbatical at Tübingen, and he did everything for 500 years on that subject in Jewish thought. And when Jesus said those things and the high priest tore his garment, he was doing the right thing. If this is a lie, it's blasphemy. Nobody makes these claims. So either Jesus is, or he's a blasphemer. Now, if he is who he says he is, that establishes it's a theistic universe. And what is a miracle by definition? A miracle is an event performed by God for a certain purpose. Now, I'd be happy to use David Hume's famous illustration, except everybody hates the word violation. It's not a violation.
Right.
But to say that God raised a man, by the way, David Hume says it would be a miracle if a man was raised from the dead. The second half of that sentence is, because it's never been observed at any time. Darn, he's just as good as the naturalists today. They won't listen to you because these things don't happen. They don't refute it. They just say it can't happen. So if it's a theistic universe and God raised Jesus and confirmed his message, now, as Tony mentioned earlier, now we've got to go for the high Christology of Bauckham, Hurtado, Mike stuff, right? The high Christology. Oh, by the way, there's a whole second generation of high Christologists that have come out now, and their books saying they've won the debate. High Christology is the way to go. And if Jesus, that's all the more blasphemous. So no, it's not circular. And by the way, that argument is from Tony Flew. It's one of Tony Flew's arguments. So here's the way he does it. You argue that the Bible is, that the Bible proves the resurrection and the resurrection proves the Bible. That's circular. But we hopefully don't argue that way. You have to break the circle. And you break the circle by using the claims critically, in my opinion, critically, then you know what he's claimed, which leaves the Father in a very bad position if this man is a heretic. And if God did, that's the definition of miracle. Definition of miracle is to perform an event that nature's laws cannot perform, and God performs them in nature from outside. Now you got a miracle. Now you got a theistic universe. And if you throw in there life after death, if you throw in there other things, we've got a whole theistic picture. And I think the resurrection fits very nicely into that package.
Love it. That's great. Here's my question for you. And then at the turn of the hour, I have a tight deadline. I'll have to drop off if you guys keep going. But I guess two-part, and you can just give us your quick take on this. Do you recommend that students do doctoral work on resurrection studies? And if so, are there particular areas that you think could be done? So, for example, on the apostles, people ask me that. When it comes to the Apostle Thomas, there's two lines of evidence, the St. Thomas Christians and Acts of Thomas. And there's debate about whether they're independent or not. If somebody could really show dependency or independency, that would be really helpful assessing tradition around Thomas. But I don't have the ability to do or the time. Is there anything reading this you thought, you know what? Doctoral study students could study this and this would be helpful, or are you saying we need to all pivot and start talking about the radical, living it out the way that you described?
Well, I think that depends on what area they're doing their PhD in. Is it straight theology? Is it a ministerial field? Is it apologetics? But yes, Ben is sitting here. When Ben came to the school and was playing hockey, he was the one of the captains on a very good ice hockey team. We were ranked in the nation every single year. When I saw Ben walking down the hall, I knew Ben, the hockey player. I didn't know Ben, the apologist. And then one day he came up to me and he said, "Yeah, I'm finishing the MA in the philosophy of religion, and you want to come to my master's defense because I'm asking, are the minimal facts a legitimate argument?" And I said, "What? I see you on the ice fighting and scoring goals, but I'm not sure." Yeah, I'll be there. Sorry, I didn't know Ben. But Ben did his dissertation, his PhD dissertation, chiefly on the question, can an historian, qua historian, say that Jesus raised from the dead? That's a new one. Is there enough data? Michael Grant raises the question: can a historian decide the empty tomb is a historical? Okay, Ben with resurrection, and he said, can some credentials in history decide Jesus was raised? I think your book is a pace setter. By the way, Sean, I just saw your book cited yesterday by a critic who says only we are the most four apostles we have good data for. And so why do you say this about the 12? And I'll say, you never heard me say the other 12 are provable. I try to tell my students never to say that. But I said, why don't you listen to what Sean said in that book? Who are the ones for sure? And we've got Peter and Paul and James, the brother of Jesus. And there might be Andrew's got a decent, but those three guys are big. Who's the most influential guys in the early church? Peter and James and Paul. And
right.
All died for their faith? Yes, they died for their faith. They didn't recant. Nope, they didn't recant. Were two of them unbelievers? Yep. And did the third one deny Christ? Yep, we got a pretty rough group of guys here. And yet they're our main witnesses. So he was trying to say that Sean's only going to give me three. And I said, well, pay attention to the three Sean gave you. Because so I think we can do that. I think there are places where we've got to come back. And Ben's asking, what about historians? Can they prove it? Mike did a very unique one where he took individual theories and did it. So I think I wouldn't just send somebody to resurrection. I require a course, like I said, I teach in resurrection, but I wouldn't just tell the class, hey, why don't you do your dissertation on the resurrection? I don't think I ever suggest it. But if they are convicted to move that way, yeah, I think there's niches that they could move into. Maybe someone's going to say the empty tomb needs to be a minimal fact, and Gary and Ben and Mike, they need to give in a little bit. The empty tomb is better than what they said. Okay, let's do it. So I think the fields. I don't suggest them per se, but I think there are other ways to get there.
It's great.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. So I know Sean mentioned he's got a hard limit coming up in about 9 minutes. Just with the other panelists, are we okay if we go maybe a little bit past 5, or do you guys have hard limits as well?
I can go to about 5:10.
5:10. Okay. Okay, cool. So at this point, we are done with the panelists, but believe it or not, there is a panelist that I invited, but he couldn't make it. And we did a pre-recording video. So this is Dr. Craig Keener. He was very desperate to contribute his congratulations to Gary as well. So let me just play that little 5-minute video clip. Okay, so sharing screen. And there we go. Is that showing up?
There we go.
All
Nice
right.
beard.
Nice beard, yeah. All right, so here it's just 5 minutes. The reason I'm kind of dressed up here, and Craig was kind enough to do this interview, is I'm doing a special for Gary Habermas, a celebration show to honor his legacy and the fact that he just finished his 4-volume work on the evidence for the resurrection. And Craig is kind enough to give sort of a speech or a series of sentences, whatever you want to do, sort of honoring Gary's legacy. So without further ado, I'll give it over to you to give your speech. And yeah,
maybe in honor of minimal facts arguments, I'll keep it short. But that's just a joke. But yeah, Gary is the kind of the father of this research, I think, in evangelical circles. He is. I mean, Mike Licona is one of his proteges, and I certainly have learned very much from Gary and from Mike, some of which Mike got from Gary. And he's been persistent with this, and he's been so kind. I don't know how he can answer all of his emails and mentor so many people so closely. I mean, there's only so much time in the day. I try to do my best, but I can't keep up with everything. But Gary is faithful in all that. He's a down-to-earth guy, so friendly, and this is a magnum opus. These 4 volumes. Now, having said that, I've only read 2 of them so far, because I think that I don't know if the third one is out. I've only seen the
it's
2.
coming out May 15th for the third
Okay.
one.
So I haven't seen it yet, but he's just such a thorough researcher and so incessant with his logic, and yet fair to the different views. His minimal facts approach is also very important, not just with regard to the resurrection, but it's important for building common ground. It's like Paul in Acts chapter 17 on the Areopagus. He starts by building common ground. And when Paul preaches in synagogues, he starts from Scripture, which makes sense for people who accept Scripture, but for people who don't, he quotes Greek poets in Acts 17. Everything he says is biblical there, and everything he says in Acts 14, 15 to 17 is biblical, but he frames it in a way that would be intelligible to the people with whom he's dialoguing. And Gary, in the same way, is able to dialogue with the rest of scholarship. And I think it's a great approach, and it's been helpful for, I think, all of us.
All right, so that's what Craig had to say in terms of your work there, Gary. So yeah, so at this point, I'll transition to the final segment. And Gary, this is going to be the fun part for you, because this whole show you've been in the hot seat. You've had to answer all the questions from the panelists. So at this point, I want to change the script. Now you can take the reins and maybe ask one question for each of the panelists. Starting with Sean, because again, he's got that deadline. So, yeah, do you have a question for Sean that you want his feedback?
Yeah, I was thinking about this before, not what question I would ask, but I was thinking about Sean. Sean, here's my question for you. How in the world did you get your looking so professional? It looks like you have a movie theater there. And Biola, I understand. But is that Batman over your left shoulder? And all the blue and the red. And every time I've done an interview with you, I think this is going to be great. Paul is going to raise the value of my real estate just from having been on in this beautiful setting. That's my question for you. Where'd you even get the idea for doing that? It's wonderful. Looks like a movie theater.
Well, thanks. I enjoy having you on all the time. I got my email today about volume 3 coming in the mail, and I thought, let's do a show on volume 3. Let's get the word out there. So I'll be shooting you an email to talk about that. Honestly, I'm super creative. I got that Biola sign off of like Amazon. I had it made. Somebody thought it said Barbie. They're like, why do you have Batman and Barbie? I guess it looks like Barbie, but it's Biola, just for the record. And the
Same thing.
Batman,
Same
I was
thing.
in the Philippines, and mine, a pastor there, bought me that Batman. I was with my son looking at all these cool things. And, I was like, this like perfectly matches it. So I have a social media team that helps me with Biola to do the lights and camera and all this kind of fun stuff. Otherwise, it wouldn't look remotely like this. But man, I feel like I got off easy. I was nervous you were gonna like nail me on one of the apostles or one of the details or something like. So, whew, out of here just in time.
No, I got one question for you. On the apostles,
Yep.
if you could argue one guy besides the big three, Peter, Paul, and Mary. No, yeah, well, I hear the Jesus seminar go around talking about Peter, Paul, and Mary in the resurrection appearance, but Peter, Paul, and James. The case could be made for the best case. Would you say? Do you really think the second century reference to John is worthless, or would you periodically think maybe it's a good case for John's martyrdom? And you got a few positive things to say about Andrew, but mostly it's those three, and then you dismiss John, if I remember correctly. Do you think there's anybody else worth bringing back in again beyond those three?
Great question. I have just finished a second edition, a 10-year update, and have slightly reassessed 5 of the apostles. I now think 3 of them died naturally: John, Matthew, and Philip. If I had to bet my house, John, I'm actually more confident that he didn't die a martyr, because there's been some work that was done by Dean Furlong and some others making the case that he died as a martyr. And I read it really, really carefully. And I think sometimes when I read the best case for something and I'm not convinced, I say, you know what, it gives me more confidence in the reverse that he didn't die as a martyr. I think that second century reference by Papias, some of the scholars that's in Philip of Cide in the 5th century, some of the scholars talked to that are experts in this have just said there's no good reason to take that's really original to Papias. But if somebody showed me it was the case, I'd love to be convinced by that. I don't think John fits in that category. The other one I'm more confident on is James, the brother of Jesus,
Right.
one of the
That's
12.
correct. Yeah, you do him as with the other three.
I put him higher on this one. So
Really?
2 in the highest possible probability.
Yeah, that's
Now
right.
I have Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Very probably true. I'm lowered down James, the son of Zebedee, in part because you said you've really got one source as reliable as it is. And I was like, you know what? Gary's right on this one. I think I'm overstating it a little bit. So I lowered that one down. And I put Paul 1 notch down because I very probably true. But we have century source as opposed to Peter 2. So I don't think there's another apostle. Thomas, I just don't think it's strong enough to go in there. Andrew, we have 2 sources, but they're just not super reliable. So I think those 4 are pretty solid. And I don't see any prospect of another apostle moving in there that I could find.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hey,
Glad you're doing an update.
it's done. Like you, I submitted. It's out. It's finished. But thanks for including me, Dale. Love you, Gary, more than you know. Appreciate you deeply. And thanks for having me on this panel. This is really a treat.
Hey, Sean, publishing your update.
It's already out with Rutledge.
Oh, really? Well, good for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, it's out. If you want a copy and you remember, shoot me the best address and I have another one. I'll send it to you. I'd be happy to.
Absolutely. We'll
Yeah.
do that. And thanks for doing volume three. I didn't say this, but you guys, Sean's not the only one here, but Sean has done a program on volume one and volume two already, and he's getting ready to do three. And Dale is coming up with another one on. You guys have been great brothers. Thanks, Sean.
You're welcome. Love you, brother.
Thank you, Sean, for showing
Love
up.
all you guys too.
Blessings.
All right, so Gary, who's your next victim? Who do you want to ask? Who?
How about you, Dale?
Okay, okay, very well. Yeah. What
What a lot of people, well, they might know, the Shroud crowd knows this, but maybe the New Testament crowd doesn't. When Dale and I had our discussions, Dale, what was the average time of one of our phone conversations? Did we average at least 1.5 hours?
Yeah, it was always supposed to be 1 hour, but then it was 1.5 to 2 hours minimum. So
And
yeah.
it went on for years, and Dale kept getting closer and closer. But as Dale was coming close on the data, I would answer his questions about the Shroud, but I pushing the Shroud per se. I would just talk about it. Then when Dale came to the Lord, and then later I see him doing Real Seeker Ministries and so on. Where do you put the Shroud in you do a kind of, you like the minimal facts kind of argument. Where do you put the Shroud up against data like that? The question I was asked earlier, but how high do you put the Shroud?
Yeah, so I can. So when I converted, I used a Bayes theorem approach. So I had a total of four positive evidences. So there's the historical evidence for the resurrection. There was borrowing from Mike Licona, the vindication prediction argument. I think that provides us with actual warrant as an independent argument. And then the third objective one was the Shroud of Turin. So I believe the percent I gave on that after my third round of investigation was, it's going to sound weird, but 72.53% was the number I plugged into Bayes as my subjective credence. So yeah, that's where I was.
You got to talk. You had to talk to Dale for years because he would be doing this Bayes theorem stuff, and every time we do it, he'd give me a new percentage, and he adjusted the percentages. So he really does do these things and does them out. Where do you think Bob Rucker's work is? How high do you put him on your list as a theoretician?
So in terms of his image formation or his work on the
Yeah,
current.
he told me he came to Liberty and lectured. He told me, I said, "How sure are you that the shroud is the bare garment of Christ?" I'm not misquoting him. Bob said 100%. He's a nuclear physicist, by the way. He said 100%. I said, "Great, Bob." 100%. I can't say that. Okay. And what percent are you sure that the shroud was caused by the resurrection of Jesus? Question two. And he goes, 100%. There's no difference between those two questions.
Yeah,
That's,
oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm definitely not that high, but Bob Rucker, he's kind of my guy. Like I think his theory is the best and it is the most detailed from a strictly scientific standpoint. The reason I like him is he has a bottom up approach. He starts with the facts, establishing the facts, and then he assesses which hypotheses can actually account for these facts. So I like that systematic approach, whereas with a lot of other pro shred, it's kind of top down. They have their theory, and then they try to get the facts to fit that. So yeah, I'm pro Bob Rucker for sure.
he's got that one essay. If you guys haven't seen it, his website, he's got an essay for 17 arguments that the image on the shroud was caused by radiation from a dead crucified body. 17 physical arguments from nuclear physics.
Awesome.
Mike, you're probably going to have to go in a little while. Should I ask you a question?
Go for it.
Here's my question. You wrote your big tome on the resurrection, and people have been asking me in one way or another, am I going to stay with the resurrection, go somewhere else? Do I think this is done? No, I'll never think resurrection is done. I might always have things to say. But in your case, you've moved over pretty heavily to New Testament. I would say reliability, but that may not be your word. Um, how much have you been captured by this idea of New Testament reliability? And do you think you'll stay there, or do you think someday you'll say, okay, it's been a number of years, and except for lecturing, I've been thinking about this, and I've got some more things to say about resurrection. I'm going to do a standalone volume that gives new material, like Sean just said about the disciples. What do you think? I'm not saying are you done with the resurrection, but are you pretty much going to stay with New Testament?
I think so. Well, yes and no. I've got two more books I want to write. One is how to share the evidence for the resurrection on a napkin. And so I'm about halfway through that one right now. It'll be a short book, it'll be a popular level book. And then after that, the last one I plan on writing will be on the historical reliability of the Gospels. That's something I've worked on for a little bit already. I'm still working on it now, and I really want to devote time over the next several years after I finish the napkin book to work on that. So, and reliability from a little different perspective than what has been written before. So it'd be like, well, what do we mean by the term reliable? We have to get to some foundation thoughts. What do we mean by reliable? How do we quantify it? What kind of criteria do we have that will, fairly work for not only, it's got to work across the board. If we're going to talk about the Gospels, it's also got to be the same criteria we would apply to the ancient historical and biographical literature. So we're not, preferring the Gospels in some kind of sense or prejudicing for their historical reliability. They've got to be fair criteria that need to be met. So that's what I want to work on. So it'll be a little different than Ben's book. It'll be different from Blomberg's book on the topic and Pete Williams, his book on the topic. It'll deal more with foundational issues and discussing reliability. I don't even know what my ultimate conclusions are going to be yet because I really need to work on it some. So with that in mind, let me just conclude by saying, because I didn't get to do this in I don't think I took 10 minutes in the beginning. I just asked those two questions. I just want to say, Gary, you've meant the world to me. Ever since that discussion in your office in the fall of 1985, that I just needed some reassurance of my faith at that time. You introduced me to the minimal facts argument at that point. And then it was the famous or infamous, however you want to do it, Baltimore call in 1989 that was really just a game changer for me and really helped me. And then the countless hours that you spent with me, helping me on the phone. I don't know how you did it, my brother. I just don't know why you gave me much of your time. And on the phone, emails, I don't think I would do that for someone today. And yet you were so selfless with your time. Honestly, I don't think, well, let me just say, I'm not even sure I'd be a Christian today had you not spent that kind of time and helped me through it. So I appreciate you very much, my brother, and you've been like a spiritual father in many ways. I love you. I respect you so much. And I just thank you for the example that you have set for me as just a really great harmonization of an academic mind and a heart for people that loves God and puts God first in your life. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Until Labor Day.
That's right. What's this, year 28, 29, something like that?
29 years in a row.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Say hi to Debbie.
I will. Love you. Thank
Love
you,
you too,
Dale,
Mike.
for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Mike, for being on. I appreciate
God
it.
bless, Mike.
God bless.
See you, Tony. See you, Ben.
All right. So, Gary, over to you as to who your next victim is.
My next victim. Boy, oh boy. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I surprised you, by the way, Dale, asking you the question about the shroud.
That was good.
I probably should have gone to Mike too, because he was trying to get off the air there. But I just got thinking, your product, you being what you became in the Lord, the finished product, it gave the shroud more of a basis than we had, so that you did on your own. You moved more into that area. Hey, wait a minute, Dale, if you put the shroud at 72.5 or whatever you said, what do you put the historical argument alone for the resurrection, not your faith? Where do you put the argument for the historical argument for the resurrection? What number?
So the numbers that I have finalized were from the time of my conversion. So I haven't updated them since then, but it was actually lower than the shroud. It was around in the 66%.
How much?
It was around the 66% range because for me, I don't have the cumulative case. It was the appearance to the 12 specifically that I think proves the resurrection, a supernatural resurrection is the best explanation. So yeah, it was
I
actually
remember you telling me over and over, Gary, I only have to get past 50 because 50 is the break-even point.
Yeah.
So if it's 52 when I'm done, I'm going to believe in the resurrection because it beats the alternative. I over and over, and I'm thinking to myself, man, are you gullible?
I converted overall the positive and all the negative evidences combined. I got at 53.14% that Christianity is true. So I converted on the 53%.
I give you credit for that, and I give you credit for what you've done in your blogging and to the Shroud people. You're very well known. And I just remember we went back there and you were going, I'm just aiming for 51. What do you want to talk about today? That kind of stuff. So thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Ben, I've got a question for you. How many questions do I have, Ben? You've taken a lot of swipes at me over the years. I
took one at you before I even came on. You don't even know it.
Oh, you did? Hey, I'll tell the rest of the group this. When Ben finished his PhD, doing the dissertation on the resurrection, he's a very, very humble guy. And he sent me an email pretty soon after. And he said, blah, 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 blah. What do you want to do about this? Ben. And I wrote back to him and I said, hey, Ben, when you write to people, especially professionally, at least put PhD after your name, because you don't have to brag. You don't have to brag about it. But once you have it, people are not going to be able to help themselves, giving you more respect for it. And you're going to want that because it'll further the gospel. It'll further your ability to witness. So this goofy guy, he sends me an email back after I tell him put PhD after your name. Do you remember what you did?
No.
He sent an email back to me and it said, Ben Shaw, comma, PhD. And underneath that it said, black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So he overdid it. And by the way, Dale, you've got a black belt in one of the karates, right?
So I have I'm like Mike Licona. I've got the black belt in Taekwondo, but my brother, he just got his black belt in Jiu-Jitsu. I'm not sure if it's Brazilian or Japanese, but yeah, I remember you told me that about
And he's about your size too, Ben. He can't get over what, 100? Does he weigh more than 160 pounds now? Your brother?
My brother?
Yeah.
I
don't remember him being very big.
Yeah, he's still very thin and stuff like that.
Well, he and Ben could be good buddies then.
I'm huge, first of all. Okay, I'm like 163, so
you're
way
163?
beyond that 160 category.
Well, when Ben comes to my house and walks in the front door, even Eileen, my wife, who doesn't go after anybody, she doesn't play those games, but she walks in and I say, honey, what do you think about Ben? She says, I don't think he's put any more weight on.
My takeaway from this is I need to start making my email signature Ben Shaw black belt, then put PhD on the second line there, and then below that do 163 pounder.
But when you say black belt, you have to say Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu too. You shouldn't just say black belt.
Yeah, that's true. I got to keep some on their toes somewhat.
Ben, what is your next book going to be on? You're trying to. Ben has been. When did you get your PhD? How long ago? 5 years?
2020,
Okay,
right
exactly.
at the start of
Five
COVID.
years. Okay, 5 years. Um, Ben keeps not knowing whether he should bring the dissertation out as a whole or making the chapters into journal articles, and he goes back and forth. Then he followed up with a book called Trustworthy with 13 arguments for the reliability of the New Testament. What is your next project going to be? Like the question I asked Mike, where are you going to go? You going to stay here? Are you going to one of those two fields, or are you going to move on to something else?
It's a good question. I've talked to someone since we've talked about publishing my dissertation, slightly tweaking a little bit of it, and she thought it'd be a good idea to submit as a proposal with my aims in mind. Another topic I've thought about is doing a resurrection book. It'd be I like the genre, I guess, of trustworthy, trying to have these points of reference, these relatively non-controversial points. It's very minimal factish, the trustworthy book, if you kind of read between the lines, because I don't think the arguments I present are relatively controversial. So I like doing the same thing with resurrection. I know 4,000 pages have already been written on it, but I think maybe I could do it a little bit different. At least I could do it shorter. I know I can do that.
Are you saying you would still keep a minimal facts format, but you would broaden it a little bit into reliability? You take a little more data than just the minimal facts.
I think so. And then so I've got an idea for my dissertation, an idea for a resurrection book, and then I'd like to do a Christology one, similar, minimal fact.
You mean high
Notions.
Christology?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But pushing where I think the discussion needs to get pushed is kind of how my dissertation argues. If those things happen, then historians need to say they happened and not appeal to methodological naturalism or status quo or whatever the case may be. It really needs to be an open inquiry into whatever the conclusions may show. So I think those would be important topics. I like Brant Pitry's book on Christology recently, but I think it could be made even better. But I really like his polemics against the current state of scholarship on a lot of those things. So I think Christology would be good. And then, in line with what you were saying, a fourth book. If I wrote Trustworthy, this one could be Faithfully, and Christology would be the other one, and Eternally, I suppose, the resurrection one. But what does it mean to be a disciple? And that kind of ties into what you were talking about. If these things are true, so what? What difference does it make? And it makes a big difference. Acts 17, 30, 31. We know Jesus is going to be judged because they're true. So that's an important factor. But then also, too, like, what are some things we can do to walk in the good works that God created beforehand that we should walk in them? What's that look like? And so I think that's kind of pointing to some of the areas that you're pointing at, too.
I just want to add something that if you are writing this book, Trustworthy, there is something that I think I'm the only one who's ever spoken about this, but in resurrection research, nobody's ever gotten into this area in philosophy called the epistemology of testimony, where there's a reductionist position versus an anti-reductionist perspective and stuff like that. So I don't know if you're familiar with that field, but I found it fascinating when I took kind of a master's course in that. And I think that would really help with treating testimonial evidence for the resurrection and stuff like that. So
yeah, no, those are all good elements, and trying to assess. I know some of the elements too that I've talked about have to do with. I think Craig Evans or Craig Blomberg have an article on. Do we trust a source when they say something, or do we start skeptical? Is the burden of proof on them that it's true, or is it the burden on proof? And they lean towards it's true if someone makes the claim, and so which is fine. It's hard for me to say one has to take one approach or the other, but I do think you got to start making a case either way you go. But my bigger issue is there's a lot of concernment about saying miracles happened or addressing those sorts of things. And so if that's even in the discussion, then that kind of stops it. But I think, Doc, one of the points I make in my dissertation is, and I've made it elsewhere too, because the dissertation is just a longer version of a journal article I wrote for the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus. But if near-death experiences happen, how do we classify that? How do we assess that? And so if we can do those sorts of things, and I think we can, I think historians should be able to say miracles happen. And a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, historians can't say a miracle happened. We don't have the tools. But I see a lot of historians writing about economics, about political theory, about war. Last time I checked, they weren't generals, but they're writing history about war. So you don't have to be a specialist in these fields to make those sorts of comments. We can assess whether or not they happen and things like that. And of course, you can learn about those different disciplines so you can intelligently comment on them. So I don't know. I think
give you an example. Charles Beard, who's an American, often called a skeptic, historical skeptic, and former president back in 1935-ish about the American Historical Association. He's talking about how we can't use history to do theology, and yet his one of probably his most famous work is an economic interpretation of the Constitution. That's his big work, an economic interpretation of the Constitution. Who died and made him an economist?
Exactly. Yeah.
You know?
Awesome. I read an article not too long ago that encouraged New Testament scholars to better engage the cognitive sciences. Awesome. I just didn't know how do I go from there? And then there's other issues too. Bias. I love discussions of biases and things like that. Doc knows we had a lot of talks on postmodernism and relativism and things like that. And I reffed hockey for 15 years in addition to playing it. And so I've seen biases in a number of different ways. I've officiated teams I've played for. And, if I've played for them, I've seen guys get tempted to not call a penalty on the other team because they don't want to look biased. But meanwhile, this guy just got a stick in the head because you didn't want to call a penalty because you didn't want to look biased. And now you're acting terribly biased towards the one team getting hit in the head with a hockey stick. So you got to call you can be objective while still not being neutral, or as the saying goes, objectivity is not neutrality. So there's a lot there, but it just needs people to clarify it, present it in ways that are effective and winsome and avoid the extremes.
Awesome.
But that's all kind of, I don't know how fruitful that is for everyday life. That's the thing I wrestle with.
Well, thank you. Tony, Tony's I was thinking while Ben's answering, I'm thinking, okay, I go to Tony next, and all of a sudden, Tony, your screen went dark.
Well, I have something.
I thought he's leaving us, and I didn't even ask my question. Tony, I was surprised before we, quote unquote, went on the air here to find out that your dissertation had a lot to do not just with the resurrection. That doesn't surprise me so much, but I want to know how you put resurrection and worship together, because I'm really interested in like I said, Volume 4, Part 2. Now that we know the resurrection is true, what else is true because of it? So I wonder how those two are tied together for you.
Yeah, well, here's the book, Gary. It's published by Peter Lang. So that was my dissertation. It's been published back in 2013, I believe, around there. So what I did, Gary, is I looked at the fact that we do have evidence, and I wrote this other book too, Early Christian Creeds and Hymns. It's published by a Canadian company called H&E. And what I do in my dissertation, in my book, is I argue that the resurrection of Jesus is what propelled the early Christians to not only reconsider his claims and also the association of Jesus with Yahweh. So I deal with a lot of the Yahweh passages where Jesus is being identified as Yahweh. For example, Romans 10:13, the one who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved, where Paul is clearly speaking of the Kurios, the Lord, Jesus is Lord. And if you believe he's Lord, God raised him from the dead, and so forth. So what I do in my book is I show that if we want to go to the earliest documents, which are the Pauline letters, we see in Paul's letters a very high Christology already at this very early stage, and that it's very obvious from Paul's letters that Jesus is worshipped. There is the Maranatha prayer in 1 Corinthians 16:22. There's the invocation, those who call upon the Lord Jesus, 1 Corinthians 1:2. There is prayers made to Jesus where Paul himself seeks the Lord to take away the thorn in the flesh 3 times, and the Lord says, "My grace is sufficient for you." And so what I do is I canvas all of the language of worship, the various words like latreo, proskuneo, and I notice that the Apostle Paul and the early Christian communities that he was corresponding with, they all worshipped him. They gave him the divine name. Philippians 2, the Carmen Christi, a very early hymn, where Paul uses the Isaiah 45:23 passage and just applies it to Jesus, that the one who will bow to Yahweh and confess, this is Jesus. And so what I argue is that the resurrection of Jesus was the catalyst to get the early Christians thinking. And of course, Pentecost as well, the coming of the Holy Spirit obviously illumined their minds. And so I see a very close association between the worship of Jesus and his resurrection, and that the sacraments are wrapped around that reality of his death and the baptism, for example. You die with Christ, you buried with Christ, you rise with Christ. The Eucharist, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. All of this is infused with Christ's the reality of his resurrection. And so I just noticed this very close association, and that's what propelled me to go into this dissertation. So if Jesus was not risen from the dead, number one, he would not be worshipped, and secondly, as Tom Wright, I think, rightfully put it, when a Messianic leader died, there were only 2 choices: you either disband, or you just go and follow the new Messiah on the block. And so I just thought that the resurrection of Jesus is intimately connected to the worship of the early church, and that Jesus was, in fact, worshiped, that it was not an evolution, that occurred with John being the last gospel who lifts Jesus above the clouds. I think all of the gospels, the synoptic gospels, Mark in particular, shows that you already have a high Christology. And I think the work of Simon Gathercole has demonstrated that the synoptics give us a pre-existent Jesus. You don't have to wait till John to get a
great book. It's a great book.
Great book indeed, yes.
Hey, but you started out at the beginning here and you said, while you're doing your work, you had the privilege of working with Larry Hurtado. Now, the whole time you're talking here, I hear Hurtado coming out, because that's he doesn't bring resurrection in. In fact, I have an issue with him on resurrection. I've got a big issue, but he is huge on the high Christology because of the worship.
Yes. Yeah. So his Magnus Opus, I believe, was Lord Jesus Christ, where he deals with the deity of Christ and so on. But it wasn't just Hurtado. I looked at Richard Bauckham as well, God Crucified, and I think Bauckham did some really good work there. I remember when I did my master's at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto, I studied under Dr. Terry Donaldson, who is a Pauline scholar, and he showed me a mug. It was the early high Christology symposium that he was at with Hurtado and Bauckham. So I think you're right. Dr. Habermas, that the early high Christology, I think, is pretty well established, and so we have an evolution of, we're born from pagan elements that that the Christian faith borrowed from paganism. No, on the contrary, they already had the necessary elements in place to have Jesus as incarnate deity, and from the get-go, they already recognized him as Yahweh incarnate.
Yeah, I think you're right. Romans 10:9 is a great one when he ties it into the name for God in the Old Testament, just 3 verses later.
That's right.
So,
Yeah, and Just to let you know, Dale and I go way back. I don't know if you remember, Gary. I actually recommended you to Dale. He was a student of mine at the seminary in Toronto, and he was just filled with questions and on everything. And so I also had the great honor of baptizing him, and I
Ah, yeah.
sent you the baptism video, if you remember. And I still remember Dale saying, I believe I'm a Christian. I want to be baptized. And he gave the statistics, the percentage reason why he was going to get baptized. And I just thought that was the first time I ever heard someone say that before they were baptized.
He said, according to Bayes' theorem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I still remember
Very
that.
good. Very good.
Absolutely.
Tony, I love the idea of saying, if resurrection, what then?
Yeah.
What do we, to what type of theology or practice do we go next if Christ is raised from the dead? So
Yeah.
I appreciate that very much, hearing that. And I got to think about the same question for me. Not whether I'm going to worship him, but what's the next point of the research.
Awesome.
And
Yeah. I've been kind of veering off in some other areas, Gary. I've written this book, No King But Christ. This is more of a contemporary Christian approach to where we are today, the church, the condition of the church, and I call it, the subtitle is The Collapse and Bankruptcy of Secular Worldviews. And so, I'm still working on areas of my research. I've contributed some papers in the Brill academic with Stanley Porter.
oh yeah,
Hellenistic Judaism and early Christianity. So I've written some papers in that area. So I'm still
another Canadian, right?
In Toronto, yeah.
master not far from here in Hamilton, Ontario.
Yeah. Oh yeah, been to Hamilton.
Yeah. So I've been doing that type of work. I'm actually writing a smaller book right now on Paul's use of the word grace and law, nomos and charis, and the relationship of the law of Moses with the New Testament law of Christ and so forth. So I've been enjoying researching, writing, and I'm also a pastor here in Toronto. And engaging with, I have an outreach to Muslims where I share the gospel with Muslims, and I'll be leaving for London in about 3 weeks. I'm heading out to London, England, to do some training there, train pastors on their faith, and just encouraging them, because as you know, Gary, the UK is not in good shape right now.
Well, have you seen? I've been sent 2 or 3 articles now in the last couple weeks that the church attendance in the UK has gone up 50%. Have you heard? These are, but they're different sources. Say that the church attendance. Now, church attendance and Christianity are two different things, but it says that they have that one guy, a friend of mine's going over there. He's going over there to teach, and he told me they're having a mini revival right now in areas in England.
Yeah.
Not true?
The Church of England has plummeted. The Church of England as a denomination, there's been, their churches are empty, but the evangelical movement is picking up now. And so,
Okay.
yeah. I know a brother over there who he came to know the Lord just through, we were part of a Facebook group, and I started sharing the gospel, and he's born again. He sent me his baptism video. He's going to meet me in London when I head over there. So a lot of great things are happening.
So that makes sense of the articles. Then they've been coming out in secular newspapers and about the revival in England. It's not Christian groups. So
Right.
Well,
Awesome.
super.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think I'll end off with one question. I can't believe nobody asked this, but so the book, volume 3 that's coming out is called Scholarly Perspectives. And so Gary and Ben, I know you were an editor, so this could be for you as well. If you don't mind giving a spoiler, is there anything, scholars that you interviewed, like a skeptic or something like that, that came up with something unexpected? Like maybe they've changed their mind on something.
You
like,
mean unexpected? Do you mean like this minimal fact looks better, or do you mean this is a naturalistic theory that I think works?
No, I'm just curious, like if one of the skeptical scholars, the non-Christian scholars, gave you guys kind of a shock, like they said, like, say Bart Ehrman changed his mind, he believes in the empty tomb again, or something like that. Is there anything like that or did the scholars just come
No,
up?
I have not checked this out, so I don't want to take this. Dale, Allison, Dale's a good buddy. But Dale, I'm telling people here, whoever hears it here, that I have only heard this as a rumor a couple places. But I heard that Dale, in a recent dialogue, said that the minimal facts argument for the resurrection is the strongest argument for the resurrection.
Interesting. Okay.
Now that's pretty
there.
That's pretty exceptional. Now,
Then,
Mike, at the end of his book, Dale's an appendix in his book.
Yeah.
And he says Dale is not another view in his book. He calls Dale a brother in the Lord. And that's what he does in his chapter on Dale. And I'm supposed to dialogue with Dale in just a few months. I'm supposed to have another I've had like 3, but Dale's a good guy, and he's really big on NDEs too.
Yeah.
He's huge in that.
I'll just quick because I've got to go. I've got an appointment with my parents, and but they're in, so we're gonna go out to eat. So I've got to run because I'm getting some messages that I need to run. But all in good. But I want to say, Doc, thanks so much. It's been great working those last 13 years, and looking forward to seeing what we're gonna do in the next few years. And just thanks for being a good, I guess, Paul. Hopefully I can be a good Timothy like Mike was. And so just appreciate it. And again, just thanks for the academic components. And I know I've said this to you before, and then also how you make sure to have time to talk to people as well.
Thank you.
So
Thank you very much. Appreciate you saying that.
Well,
and Tony, I'll tell you, well, Dale knows this, I think.
See you guys.
Take
See
care,
ya.
Ben. Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye, Ben.
Here, Ben.
My wife, who passed away in 95, was Canadian.
Oh,
Her whole family was Canadian.
okay.
I think her dad fought in one of the wars, but he was a Canadian soldier. And they all came over from Canada, and there were 6 kids, and 3 were born in Canada and 3 were born in the U.S. So, and we're all from Detroit. And
Okay.
so I figured out what would my kids say? What percentage are my kids' lineage, just from like grandparents closer? And my family would be 38% Canadian.
Wow.
That's a pretty high percentage.
Where were they from?
Sorry?
In Canada, where are they from?
My family's from Peterborough area.
Peterborough, I know it very well, north of here. My brother-in-law lives there.
Yeah, now there's a lake there, which I've been at. I used to have family reunions in Peterborough. And I'm telling you what, my relatives are not from Montreal. But I will tell you, the English-speaking Canadians, my family, boy, do those older women like to hug and kiss. I don't see that in America. They were real huggers and kissers when I was growing up. And we would have the reunion by this lake that's called Jarvis Lake.
Yes.
And as I understand it, that lake was named after my family. Now, that's what I've always been told. I don't know if that's true or not.
Oh, got to check.
Do you know where the Madoc is?
I've heard of it. I'm not sure exactly where it is, but I have heard of it.
That's where my grandfather's family's from, Madoc.
Okay.
And
I'll just say my grandfather is from there as well, actually.
Really? Well,
Yeah.
golly, it's not a very big town, so that must be the only 2 people there, Dale.
Yeah.
But my grandfather's dad, my great-grandfather, was a circuit riding holiness preacher in Canada. And around 1900, 1905, my grandfather was born in 1907. I mean, he's deceased, but we still have the lanterns that he had on the buckboard wagon where he went from revival to revival and preached.
Wow.
And when the money dried up from doing ministry, he went to Quebec and worked in the gold mines for years.
Wow.
So
We have
that's my family.
We've got a Canadian connection.
Canadian connection. I'm proud of it. I tell people, although from teaching and going out west, Ontario, I'm fine with Ontario, but they remind me of Americans. They're a little bit feisty. The Canadians out west are way more laid back. And I was teaching one time at Vancouver. I'll stop with this, Dale. I was teaching at Trinity Western Seminary a couple times, and there was one American in the class, and all the rest were Canadians. and the Canadians, oh, here's the joke. American said one morning, it was during the Iraq War or something. He goes, "Hey, did you guys hear that Canada got involved in the war yesterday?" And the Canadians said, "What?" He goes, "Yeah, they sent their tank over yesterday." That was the joke. But the Canadians in my class, the Western Canadians, the Quebec guys that I know, my family would never say this, but the Western Canadians said, "We're sick and tired of them taking our oil and selling it in Montreal and even Ontario, and we could give it to the US and make twice the money." And then somebody goes, "As far as I'm concerned, we should become the 51st state." And I said, "You guys are not supposed to say that. That's the one thing I knew in my family. We were not supposed to say, well, you've been nicer to us than our own people have." And they would say that over and over, these Western guys, that were really easygoing. So,
Yeah.
well, hang in there, guys. Good being with you. Dale, thanks for putting this together, man. You did a great job.
Awesome, Dale.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to both of you guys and all the other guests that have taken off. This has been great. And yeah, I hope it's been a fitting tribute to your legacy, Gary, and all the rest.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you so much. It's because, hey, you're going to send this to me, right? And I can put it on my website and YouTube.
Absolutely. Yep.
In fact,
Everyone.
it's long enough. I could probably do it in 2 parts, if not 3 parts.
Absolutely.
But-
Yeah, you guys. Everyone's free to post this up in whole or in part, whatever you guys want to do on your channels. So
Thanks,
Gary,
dude.
Gary, let me just thank you for your work, Gary, and I appreciate it. And I love you, brother. And thank you for taking Dale under your wing when I referred him to you. And thank you so much. The Lord used you as his chosen instrument. And so thank you, thank you. Love you, brother. And look forward to the day we'll be around the throne rejoicing, and you'll meet your dear wife who passed back in '95.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you guys so much.
Thank
Lord
you.
bless you.
Blessings to you.
Bye-bye.